Antwerp. Today, it's the second largest port in Europe. For thousands of years, ships have navigated the muddy waters of the Scheldt, some with honest mercantile intentions, others with a more nefarious or murderous intent. Whilst as historians, we are very used to the idea of studying geography from the perspective of campaigns and battlefields, the area of geographical influence on grand strategy has a more checkered past. Tonight, Paul Leyland makes his Napoleonic Wars pod debut to talk about the vitally strategic city of Antwerp. We talk about why the Scheldt was causing aneurysms for the British government for centuries before the Napoleonic Wars, how its strategic influence shifted over the course of the war, and what, if anything, has changed that situation in more modern times. This is Antwerp, the thorn in Britain's side. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, your quartermaster and host today, Liam Telfer. As always, got the wing commander, the forlorn hope, the valiant stormer, the cracker of the whip, the bearded boy, perhaps, or the boy who lived, the boy who podcasted. Maybe I've taken that too far. How are you, Zach?
There are so many things that I just want to shout at you for there. The forlorn hope. Wow. Thank you for that. I think many people would agree with you in that assessment. I can't deny, but I think you're on firmer ground with the Harry Potter connections because, I've only had about 2 decades of that in my life, ever since the books came out. And people went, oh, look, he's got brown hair and glasses, therefore he's Harry Potter. Thank you so much for your original contributions. Literally every single person I knew at school. So, hi. Good to see you, mate. I guess is meant to be like the podcasty message. But I'm not quite sure if this is kind of the relief that you've finally been brought off Paw Patrol duty at play there.
That's it. I mean, hanging out with my daughter and my son. My daughter's 4, my boy's 8 months. When you hang around with children all day and don't talk to grown-ups, it does something very strange to you. And when I started those monikers, I just couldn't stop, I'm afraid.
I have bad news for you. When you're talking to me, you are absolutely not talking to an adult.
Yeah, but at least you haven't got like unicorn face paint and you're trying to put stickers all over my forehead.
Not yet, but that is something that we can turn into a podcasting tier. So I'm going to market that. That is a marketable commodity.
If the punters are going to pay for it, you know me. That I wouldn't be doing my quartermaster's job without pushing every opportunity to push things onto the punters. Anyway, back to tonight's topic. And as Zach alluded to in the intro, we've got a very special episode tonight. Again, one of those ones that's looking at the sort of stories that kind of everyone has some awareness of, but we're really going to deep dive into that sort of that Antwerp piece that's so important. And tonight's guest is Paul Leyland. Paul's a strategy advisor. His interest in Antwerp and the Scheldt, I'm going to murder that repeatedly throughout this episode, as I'm sure Zach will as well, because he loves mispronouncing things. With the Scheldt was
not
triggered.
Inaccurate, but rude.
We've started hot tonight. So Paul's interest in Antwerp and the Scheldt was triggered while researching his BA dissertation back in 2000, where he sought to demonstrate that the French strategy during the 7 Years' War had the potential to make France the main Atlantic great power. But it was bundled in the execution, overturning the still generally accepted view that the Ancien Regime France was trapped in a war with little to gain, simply hurrying the end of the monarchy. Paul's further research as an amateur historian over the last 20 years slowly started to find a historical thread that places Antwerp at the heart of English and then British geopolitics from 1500 on up until the Second World War. And we're going to be deep diving into that tonight. Paul's chapter, you can find that in the name of that chapter, is Britain's Achilles heel. We can find that in Hellions, Sailors, Ships and Sea Fights, that was published earlier this year. And as always, we will put links to that book in the show notes. Wow. So deep diving on Antwerp, and I'll jump straight in, Paul, if you're happy to do so.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So, I love a good set the scene, build up the tension. Can you set the scene for us? Give us an idea of Antwerp's strategic significance prior to the Revolutionary and Napoleonic era.
Absolutely. That's many hours in itself, so I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. But essentially, the maritime and then naval world changed dramatically at the beginning of this end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, as the Portuguese and Spanish discovered the Americas and discovered the sea route around Africa to India and the Asian spice trade. And the main reason why the maritime world changed is because ships got an awful lot bigger and became much deeper draft. And so a very large Portuguese galleon would have a draft of maybe 8 meters, which is pretty similar to Victory's. In fact, it's pretty similar to a super dreadnought sailing in the early part of the 20th century. This was a huge step change from little ships to very big ships. Now, over time, there were more and more big ships, which we'll talk about. But at that point, suddenly Europe needed a deep water port. Now, the British Isles is very lucky to have lots of deep water ports because of the nature of its geography. Europe's far, far more limited because of wetland, because of silting, because of lots of geographical reasons. But it just so happens that the river Scheldt is deep, straight, easily navigable, all the way down to Antwerp. And so from 1500 up until the beginning of the Dutch revolt, Antwerp became the biggest port in Europe and probably the biggest port in the world. By the mid-16th century, it had about 100,000 people living there, which was roughly the same size as London. And it had about 15,000 mariners working in and around the port. It could handle about 2,500 ships a week. So it was a huge port all of a sudden. And it was the port which you could supply as well as put together a fleet of first-rate battleships relatively easily, which we'll come on to. France didn't really have a port on the Atlantic or the Channel that they could do that. Only really Toulon could do that. And it was a port where you could assemble an army relatively easily and feed and supply that army because the Scheldt is connected to the Rhine Delta, which flows all the way from Geneva. So you've got an amazing logistical supply chain going through some of the most fertile and populous parts of Europe. So because Antwerp was so big and so important in the 1570s and 80s, it didn't take any imagination for the British government, or the English government, I should say, to realize that if Spain could control Antwerp and the Scheldt estuary, then Spain could invade England quite successfully. So in 1585, England put an army on the island of Walcheren, which blocks the Scheldt estuary at its mouth, and your listeners will be really familiar with Walcheren from 1809, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And that essentially prevented the Spanish Armada from finding a deep water port to link up with Parma's army. And so the Armada was stuck out at sea, couldn't get inland. The army and the fleet couldn't join, and the rest is, as it were, history. The Armada was defeated. There are a lot of other occasions between 1588 and the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars where luck and happenstance intervene to effectively keep Antwerp from being used. But essentially, the key was it was really in the Dutch interests to prevent Antwerp from being a successful port, because when Antwerp was blockaded, Amsterdam in particular grew to being a hugely wealthy city that could afford, through the Dutch Republic, a very large navy. Now, again, as we'll come on to, that created its own problems because they had a draft problem as well. You couldn't get much more than 5 meters of draft and sail into Dutch waters, but it was still very serviceable for the 17th century. And so the Dutch, when they were a great power during their golden age, made sure that Antwerp couldn't work to protect their economy, and that basically protected Britain. As we'll come on to, I'll briefly do the 18th century. There was an understanding that Belgium, as it were, the Habsburg Netherlands, had to be kept neutral. And the way that was achieved with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which was still basically extant when the Revolutionary Wars started, was to give what is now basically Belgium to Austria and say to Austria, you can have Belgium, but you can't have a navy and you can't have any commerce, which Austria understandably wasn't that pleased with, didn't really particularly want Belgium on those terms. And the story of the 18th century from the 1750 onwards is basically the story of Austria trying to give Belgium away for something better, which would have had a huge problem for Britain. And during the course of the 18th century, the Dutch Republic waned from being a great power to being a second-rate power. And just on the eve of the Revolutionary Wars, Britain made absolutely certain that the Dutch Republic was a second-rate, maybe third-rate power by fighting the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which was part of the American War of Independence, which hammered the Dutch economy, its empire, its navy, and made it a fertile place for revolution itself. So there's an awful lot to unpack there, but essentially Antwerp is key as the only serviceable deep water port that can manage a fleet and put an army and a fleet together in the whole of Northwest Europe, on the continent of Europe. And the way in which Antwerp had remained neutralized for a couple of centuries was largely because the Dutch wanted it to be neutralized. But if the Dutch don't want or can't manage to create the situation where Antwerp is neutral, and the Habsburg Austrians also struggle to do that because they don't want to or they're not able to, then the port, which is the only port in which you could invade Britain from, suddenly becomes available to a resurgent France. And so that's the sort of situation that Britain's teetering on in 1792, and why Antwerp is so important, because if France can get their hands on Antwerp, they can get their hands on the best deep water port in the whole of Northwest Europe, and therefore change the geopolitics of the imperial struggle and also the struggle between battle fleets.
So what you have here fundamentally is a thorn in Britain's strategic side. And I always find it very...
It's worse than a thorn.
Well, yes, dagger perhaps would be a more apt metaphor. And it often surprises me how significantly this concept seems to pass people by. Admittedly, I only became aware of it probably when I was starting my doctorate and sort of listening to more conference papers and reading more widely. That was when the penny dropped for me. Having sort of previously thought, well, maybe the Med is sort of seen as more significant because Gibraltar and that kind of history that we're brought up on of Nelson in the Mediterranean and all the rest of it. And then somebody made the point, well, where are you going to launch an invasion from? And as soon as you realize that, then the penny really drops. As you've explained, the British really do understand this. And you made a point there about the English occupying the island of Walcheren to thwart the Spanish Armada. So my immediate rabbit hole, which is what we do so well on this show, is give you a list of questions and then go, no, we've got something more interesting to talk about right now. Are there ever thoughts of creating a more established presence on the island of Walcheren? And I would imagine the answer to that will be yes. Therefore, the follow-up has to be, why don't they go anywhere?
It's a great question and a proper rabbit hole, more of a warren. So essentially, Queen Elizabeth did not want what we would now term a continental commitment, because in the context of upsetting the Habsburgs, because she knew the Habsburgs were a key ally in a sort of balance of power politics against the French. So she had no problem with a continental commitment per se. She tried to take and keep Le Havre early in her monarchy, but this was a different thing entirely. This would have been a very, very big ask. So essentially, Sir Francis Walsingham, one of my heroes, basically conned her. and said, look, you can't trust the Dutch. What you're going to have to do is have some sort of surety so that when you loan them money, you know they're going to get it back. And the best thing that we can do is take some of their key ports that they're definitely going to want back. And so they became the cautionary towns. But if you look at what those cautionary towns are, it's pretty clear what their geopolitical role is. So they took Vlissingen, Flushing, which again you'll know from 1809. It's the only deep water port on Walcheren. They took Fort Rammekens, which Napoleon rebuilt. It's the oldest sea fort in Europe, and it's designed to control that river mouth and estuary flowing into the Scheldt. And they took Den Brill, which essentially is a way to get supplies into Walcheren, because if you don't supply your troops well in Walcheren, they start dying, and to get troops onto the mainland really easily, and also to give them a port that's in Holland, because the other two are in Zealand. So this is really easy to think that, oh yeah, the purpose of this is to keep the Dutch states honest, because that's how Sir Francis Walsingham sold it. And when he died, I think in 1890, or relatively closely after the Armada, all his papers were burned. So the Elizabethans knew in a half knew what was going on, but they kept the cautionary towns until 1616. So you may have heard that the Royal Navy was basically disbanded, and the sailors were treated terribly after the Armada. But the garrisons in the cautionary towns were kept at British expense. It was a huge expense. Ireland and the land force occupying the Netherlands were the two big costs that Elizabeth wouldn't let go of. Not the Navy, not the Blue Water. And so it changed when James I came into power, partly because he was a Stuart with a completely different mindset, partly because there was a truce. And so in 1616, what could possibly go wrong in 1616? 30 Years' War, what's that? He sold the cautionary towns back to the Dutch because it was short of money, because he didn't like Parliament very much. Then, I'll keep this brief now, fast forward to Charles II, and he thought it was a great idea to give the Dutch a kicking to try to gain more imperial spoils for Britain. And suddenly, at the very last moment, realized that if France was able to totally conquer the Dutch, Britain was screwed. I imagine, some admiral perhaps whispered in his ear. And so at the very last minute, he tried to swap sides in 1673 and say to William III, who was then stadtholder, if you were to give us Walcheren and Cadsand, which would be fulfilling the role of Den Brill, then maybe we could come onto your side. And William said, well, first of all, I don't trust you. And second, I've already had my country overrun by a foreign army. I don't need another one. So on your bike. And then in 1678, he genuinely threatened to swap sides and ended the war. So there was this glimmer in Stuart's policy. Then obviously, James II got kicked out. We had a Dutch monarch. So the Dutch were totally cool with this. That was a win-win for them. Queen Anne was something of a blue water Tory. Marlborough understood the importance of a presence, and he tried to create a British axis of defense of Belgium and the southern part of the Netherlands that was north-south rather than east-west. And as your listeners will know about the Napoleonic and Revolutionary Wars, the Dutch obsess over east-west, fairly obviously why. The British tend to get dragged onto an east-west axis, whereas actually it's the coast and the estuary that Britain most cares about. He was overruled because we wanted to be nice to our allies. And then he was marginalized by the Tory government. It then very briefly came back as an idea in about 1725 when the Undersecretary of State said, you know what, Belgium's really silly. Why don't we just partition it and we'll have the coast? And the Prime Minister, as it were, Robert Walpole, said, that's just going to upset the Austrians. And frankly, I don't want to have that conversation. Nice idea, but no. And then we sort of drifted into an ever more sort of imperialist Atlanticist view until the crisis of the Revolutionary Wars. But there was, again, a real panic in the 7 Years' War because the French had a brilliant idea to take Belgium off Austria in return for getting Silesia back off Prussia. And one of the reasons why this was then forgotten by history is, again, your listeners will be really familiar with Julian Corbett. He wrote a brilliant book on the 7 Years' War, except there's a couple of lines in it that aren't brilliant. They're really misleading, because he says the Second Treaty of Versailles was just going to get some little towns on the Belgian border for France and put some Bourbon in charge of Belgium. And what's that for? He didn't look at a map and see that those were the very barrier towns that stripped away Belgium's defenses from France. And with a Bourbon in charge of Belgium, it becomes a French satellite. So it's Bourbon French policy and Valois policy before the Bourbons. It's a way of assimilating Belgium. And had they done that with France on the Dutch border, the Dutch can't say no to opening the Scheldt. There's just no way that happens. So the French had a brilliant Atlantic strategy, marched into Germany, and messed it up royally.
It's something that we talk about quite often on here, and that whole, nothing happens in isolation. And I think that Antwerp must be one of the best examples of that, right? And, coming from, this is one of those episodes for me where it's sort of intensity, it comes from a place of intense interest, but without much knowledge. And I'm almost shocked as to why this isn't being talked about more, right? Like you say, it's that absolute thorn in England's side, and how close France came over a number of periods, and the Spanish, it's fascinating. So I want to sort of move forward, or where we are now with the threat of revolutionary France, and at which stage, and is it a case of revolutionary France, and then Napoleonic France, or is it a mix of the two? At what stage do they realize how much the seizure of Antwerp would affect its maritime strategy? Is that coming from the revolutionary government, or is it later? And is their focus at that point more for commercial purposes or military, or perhaps both?
Sure, it's certainly both in theory. But it's very hard to be commercial in practice when you have the Royal Navy outside before you've built a fleet. That's the key to the Royal Navy blockade, which we can sort of come back to. So I'll park that to answer the other bits, and then we'll come back to where the commercial bit fits in. So the revolutionary French government understood the latent value of what they got immediately. In November 1794, they issue an edict saying the Scheldt is now open to commerce. So they get it. But the issue that they've got is that Antwerp has not been used as a full deep sea commercial port. It has some use, but it's a backwater. So it needs huge amounts of investment, of time and money and men to make it a commercial and especially a military port. And the thing that the revolutionary government doesn't have is time, money, and men. And so even to the extent that when Napoleon is planning his invasion of Britain, sort of, in 1803-5, he can't use Antwerp because it's simply not ready. But the thing that changes everything is the Treaty of Peace of Tilsit in 1807, when Napoleon announces that land war is over, and of course I'm not going to start another one, and therefore our focus is going to be on the marine and on the sea, and that is the point. When there's only really sideshows occurring until the Wagram campaign, which the investment in Antwerp really begins, and from 1809-10, it is the major French arsenal for producing ships, which we can come on to. The Walcheren campaign doesn't even scratch. It starts producing lots of ships. It also gives the opportunity for other ships, should Napoleon try to do something, to combine in the pool and create a battle fleet that could potentially outnumber anything that Britain's got, because Britain's got global commitments, and the French don't have to worry about that. And so what Napoleon understood, people tend to think that after Trafalgar, that was it for the French Navy. Not the case at all. Napoleon basically stopped the French Navy from sailing about, because every time they sailed about, they lost ships to the Royal Navy. And so even to the extent that British shipbuilding could have a little holiday in the middle of a war, because there were so many foreign ships that being brought into British service through capture. So the thing that Napoleon needed to do, he was a Mahanian before Mahan, was build a battle fleet that was big enough to threaten the Royal Navy through sheer scale and make sure that it couldn't be picked off in penny packets. And if you can build that and then sail it quickly into Antwerp, you've got half a chance, because it's less than 24 hours sail with a stiff easterly from Antwerp into the Thames.
Straight away, another really important point made there in this idea that, hey guys, Trafalgar being the be all and end all, and that's it in terms of naval story. No. What do people think Copenhagen was about? Right? We didn't go to Copenhagen on holiday. We went there to steal a navy so that Napoleon couldn't pilfer it. And for all of the questionable morality of that decision from a strategic, hard-headed, hard-nosed perspective, like that was the call to make from the British perspective anyway. So it's really nice to make that point. I want to stay with the French perspective, if we can, to kind of talk about the flaws and the challenges of France's maritime structure in the Channel, in the home ports, because I must admit we've never done a kind of zoomed out perspective on how French naval strategy and its maritime, well, its naval strategy is effective, but also how is its maritime capacity kind of coping? Just talk us through that. I know that's a very big question.
Yes.
But how is France at this point when it comes to all of its sort of boaty related things?
Frustrated. So this is one of the things that I'm working on to try to explain better. But essentially, it mostly comes down to wetland. Because if you look at a map of wetlands of Europe, you'll see that France has got a lot of wetland, except for the Channel, which we'll come on to. You can't build a port in a wetland environment, which means you have to move the ports upriver. But then you look at the number of large river estuaries that France has got. It's a huge country, but it's bereft of river estuaries. All the rivers combine into each other and then pop out at a few little points, even to the extent that when Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister and minister of marine and the colonies, said, what we're going to do is build Toulon on the Atlantic. That will sort us out. And they chose Rochefort. And Rochefort is next to a swamp, and it's never good. The river meanders, it silts, even to the extent that when they built a really beautiful dry dock that was capable of handling 74s, within about a decade it had silted up and not even a frigate could get to it. So they're just doomed. It's like really sort of sad and tragic. The one of those questions in history that I can't yet answer, and I suspect it's got something to do with civic rights, is why Bordeaux wasn't made more of an Atlantic port. Because if they're choosing Rochefort, it's not like they need to be desperately near to the Channel. So further up from Rochefort, you've got Nantes. Nantes are great, frankly. It's a trading port for small amounts of goods, so it's a big slaving port. But that's because that can be done with a relatively small number of ships. So you can sail up a narrow river and conduct profitable commerce, but you can't assemble a fleet. Lorient is cut off from nearly everywhere. Brest has the most amazing natural harbor, but it's literally miles from everywhere. And this is, again, one of the hidden truths of the Napoleonic Wars that I want to get out there a bit more. The blockade of Brest was not about stopping the French Navy from escaping from Brest, in my view. It was partly that, but it just wasn't good enough. there was always going to be weather conditions where the Royal Navy was off station and the French could get out. The key to the blockade was that without maritime traffic, you couldn't supply Brest effectively. So even though you might have 50 ships in the roads, you could only man 20 of them. And even with that, you could only put enough provisions on those ships for them to do a month or so sail, so they can't do much damage. Which is why Napoleon decided he was going to build a canal. Now, if you know about canals, canals make a load of money by letting people get to places that you can't get to otherwise. You look at the Brest-Nantes Canal, it's the most insane canal because it follows a coast route, basically, through some wetland. I mean, it's got no commercial value whatsoever. But if you think, well, we can get supplies into Nantes because the Royal Navy can't be everywhere, and then we can take them by barge to Brest, then we can man those 50 ships that are in Brest. And the Royal Navy squadron off Ushant was never that large. If they could man 50 ships, they could blow a hole in that squadron, even if they were, second-rate mariners compared to the Royal Navy. So this is where, Brest without that logistical support is useless. The Brest-Nantes Canal was finally finished, but only after the Napoleonic Wars, because Napoleon couldn't build a canal and fight his way across Europe at the same time. So Brest is the problem that takes you to the Atlantic. Then you look at the Channel coast, the problem stops being wetland and it starts being silt, because the Gulf Stream takes the southwester wind and current up the Channel. The English coast is largely, as it were, refused, but the French coast lies right in the way. So every single French Channel port silts up. Even Le Havre on the mouth of the Seine silts up, which is why when the French battle fleet, which was assembled with so much care and pride in the 1690s, finally got into the Channel, they fought a battle at Barfleur, which is basically a draw, then realized that they couldn't fight a reinforced Royal Navy and Dutch Navy, and had to beach themselves because they had no ports to get to. So they lost, I can't remember, roughly 2/3 of the fleet, which were cut out and burned by fire ships and Royal Marines. They weren't Royal Marines then, but you know what I mean. So the lack of a Channel port. Now imagine if France had Antwerp at that point. They would have fought the indecisive Battle of Barfleur, thought, that was annoying. Let's put into port and have another go. Same is basically true of Trafalgar. Only 1/3 of the French ships engaged at Trafalgar were captured or destroyed at the battle. 2/3 of them were basically taken out of the war because they were interned in Spain, or destroyed in storms because they couldn't get to a port. So had that battle occurred close to the geopolitical center of gravity in the Channel North Sea, near a deep water port, those losses wouldn't have been incurred. They were incurred because France is forced to fight from substandard ports in far-flung parts of Europe without being able to deploy and sustain force in the Channel or North Sea. So if you're the French Navy and you read Mahan, you probably get quite annoyed. It's like, we do get it. We do know we need a battle fleet. Where do we put it?
Looking at that, I just want to go back to that logistic point. Obviously it's very difficult to do anything about nature. You've either got the coastline to build a port or you don't. Like you say, building it on a swamp is never going to work. Using the sort of Brest example, someone, Napoleon, using Napoleon as an example, he has a vast amount of resources at his disposal, at various points during his reign. Why don't they do the logistic bit and let the wet bit take care of itself? Apologies for my rudimentary.
Great question. Because Napoleon is an intensely impatient man, and it takes a lot of people to build a canal. So he started it in 1803, i.e., when there was a brief period of peace. He started it again, very briefly, about 1810. But if you're facing the combined might of the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians, you don't keep men back to build a canal. Now, what he should have done, Napoleon believed that the greatest mistake, or he said so in exile in St. Helena, and for what it's worth, I agree with him, his greatest mistake of his entire reign was to fail to accept the truce proposals offered by the supposed coalition in the autumn of 1813, when basically the Austrians tried to broker a deal and said, look, if you just give us Poland back and leave our backyard alone, we're done. But Napoleon thought, Austria will never dare attack me again after Wagram, and hey, I'm part of the family now. And Russia finds it almost impossible to deploy force into Eastern Europe without massive allied logistical support. So without Austria, it's only the Russians and the Prussians, and he knows he can beat them, and he can. He's right. Lutzen and Bautzen demonstrate that he can beat them. So he's like, nah, I'm going to risk it. Now, what's remarkable is that he's then offered another deal in November 1813. This is supposedly when the Napoleonic Wars are almost over and the coalition is just rolling into Paris. It's not the case at all, because the coalition doesn't particularly fancy crossing the Rhine, because it knows that that takes it right out of its logistical comfort zone and right into Napoleon's backyard. And so they offer the deal again. And remarkably, the agent of the British government on the spot, Lord Aberdeen, says, yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, you should be able to keep Belgium and the Netherlands. Won't be any problem with that, will there? This is the guy who messes up the Crimea much later in life. Lord Liverpool sends him an angry note. Says, I think you might have misrepresented British policy. But fortunately, Napoleon himself doesn't accept the deal. He tries to in February 1814, when, funnily enough, the deal's off the table. But in November 1813, he still thinks, hey, I can fight for this. I can win. But had either of those deals been accepted, then your point stands. Napoleon not only keeps Antwerp, but he also plumbs in Brest to a logistical network. So we can take I can't remember how many ships would have been in Brest in 1813, but it would not have been insignificant. Fully supply them and man them for a channel dash, as it were, which under the right weather conditions is doable. The Royal Navy can't be everywhere. Get them into Antwerp, along with the sizable fleet that's being built in Antwerp, and suddenly he doesn't have disparate squadrons, he has a battle fleet. And not only does he have a battle fleet, but he has his eastern flank secured because he's made peace again. This is game over for Britain, and this is the second half of 1813.
I mean, I'm not known for being one who compliments Napoleon on pretty much anything on this podcast. So it won't surprise folks to hear that I agree with a lot of that. Having said that, I do feel that some of the peace proposals that he gets, we will get back to Antwerp in a minute, guys. Like, don't worry, we're rabbit holing. welcome to the show. If you're not familiar, this is what we do. But yeah, with the proposals that he gets initially in 1813, I do have this slight sense that particularly Russia and Prussia just ask too much, to the point where they are trying to sort of pay Napoleon with his own coin. Like, we'll allow you to have X, Y, and Z. And from Napoleon's perspective, when you wargame it, you kind of go, but he's already got these things. Like,
yes.
Why would he say yes to it? But I completely agree with you in relation to Austria. A much more intelligent handling of the Austrians would have then enabled him to consolidate. And this is always the big thing with Napoleon. And I like how you put it. Much later on, he's like, yeah, can we go back to those proposals we were talking about 3 months ago? I'm suddenly interested in those again, because he's always looking for that edge and he's always wanting to dominate. But it's a rant I've had many times on this show, so we should probably move on. I'm going to do so by just digging into something that you talked about earlier in relation to Antwerp, which was the sort of the shipbuilding, the trade, because you talked about how there are these facilities that enable the French to potentially do really quite remarkable things. And reading between the lines of what you're saying, we're talking replace the losses of Trafalgar, replace the losses of the Nile, you name it, and actually become the dominant naval power in Europe during this time. So Is that fair? I guess is the first question, but also give us specifics and talk us through some of the numbers.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that I'd say that Britain had two very, very clear advantages over and above geography that we've talked about. The first is that because of all of those deep water ports, Britain was able to build and man a lot of first-rate ships of the line. And, the French typically had smaller warships, partly because of their logistical limitations. The role of Antwerp was to become a factory for 80s and 100-gun ships of the line. Yes, it's a game changer for the size of ship that France can deploy, as well as the number of ships.
It's probably just as well that this isn't a video cast, because certain words came out of my mouth there that probably aren't appropriate for younger listeners. There aren't any younger listeners of the show, but you know what I mean. That's really significant. 80s, hundreds, because as folks may know from our naval series, the staple is the 74. So even if you sort of factor in this thing of, well, the British can fire at a certain rate that is faster, well, if you've got more guns, it doesn't really matter if the other guy can fire faster, because you've got more of them to fire in that first salvo anyway, so you're going to do more damage.
Absolutely. So to put this into context, between just looking 1807 and 1815, the supposed lull in naval warfare, but absolutely not in shipbuilding, there were 28 larger scale, above the size of frigate warships built in France, excluding Antwerp. 14 were built in Antwerp, and Antwerp was only ramping up. Britain built 34. So that's an advantage of 8 to France, including Antwerp. On top of that, France was busy shipbuilding in Italy as well, Venice and Genoa. Then this is the other key thing that I think there is a tendency to miss. By their nature, mariners are mobile. They are the ultimate itinerant worker. And you see it even as early as, the crew of the Mary Rose was probably 1/3 non-English, 2/3 English. Had Napoleon been given a period of peace and been able to use Antwerp as the entrepot into Europe, so everything coming from the world doesn't need to go to London anymore, except for the British market. It can go into Antwerp and sail down the Rhine, which is what it does now. Antwerp and Rotterdam are the two largest ports in Europe for that very reason. And at the time, this time, Rotterdam wasn't that useful because it was silting. It didn't have the industrial dredging capability. So consequently, what you have is a perfect storm, because you have the ability to build large warships, which was France had a relatively limited ability before Antwerp. You have the ability to concentrate those warships in a large space. And because you have the ability to generate a lot of commerce with peace, you can create a lot of sailors. And that doesn't mean that lots of Frenchmen suddenly think, you know what, I'd love to become a sailor. It means the sailors of the world start congregating with French traffic, which means they then get pressed. And you look at the crew list of HMS Victory as an example of only about 440 of the crew are actually English. I'm sure there are also other parts of the British Isles that are represented quite highly, but there's a huge diaspora. There was a Brazilian, there's a few people from Africa. That diaspora is in the Royal Navy because the Royal Navy controls global trade. You control Antwerp, and you control at least a big chunk of global trade. Not all of it, but a big chunk of it. You start, therefore, generating sailors. You generate sailors, you compete with the Royal Navy on equal terms. 5 years of peace is fortunately the one thing that Napoleon was structurally indisposed and unable to give himself. He defeated himself.
I mean, that's a bombshell in itself, right? So we're in 1813, and the Antwerp's ramping up, right? This is when it's sort of becoming more established. And I mean, creating these 80 gun and 100 gun ships. What's the initial British response to this? And how much emphasis are they placing on the strategic importance of Antwerp and the estuary at that time? It's that post 1805 thing where apparently naval warfare almost doesn't happen because of Trafalgar, but clearly France's ability to build ships on this scale must have had people in the Admiralty in Parliament scratching their beards somewhat.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to wind back a few years, only a few, the result was the Walcheren expedition. So essentially, as soon as Britain had the wherewithal to try to stop this, they tried. And it's worth putting into context, the 40,000 men on Walcheren, that was the biggest single lift in British amphibious warfare history until Britain invaded Egypt in 1882. And that was only the same. So more men were deployed in the Crimea over time, and obviously in the Peninsular War over time, and in the Boer War over time. It was the biggest single lift. And interestingly, just as an aside, the French matched that when they invaded Egypt under Napoleon, which shows you how powerful Toulon is in its own terms, just in the Mediterranean, so it's not a threat to Britain. So putting the British Army deploying 40,000 men in one place is a huge, huge thing. But to paraphrase Napoleon, it's too big for a raid and not big enough for an invasion. It's a classic case of big hands, small maps, or if you forgive a pun, it's a barge too far. Because they essentially think, we can sail down the Scheldt. No, you can't. And had they understood what really happened to the Armada, they'd have realized that. You can't send a deep water fleet down the Scheldt unless you control both banks. You can't control both banks with 40,000 men in the context of 1809. I mean, sure, there was a brief moment. It's like that, it's a classic fallacy of trying to pretend that your aims and your strategy is justified. There's a brief moment when 40,000 men look like they might be able to make a difference because Antwerp isn't terribly well defended. But the problem is Antwerp is linked, the Scheldt flows into France itself. France's ability to deploy troops into Belgium is second to none. The logistics of deploying troops into Belgium just massively favors France, which is why it's always a nightmare for Britain. So why Belgium can be overrun relatively quickly, far more easily than France and from Germany, which has got some choke points. So sure, it wasn't terribly well defended because Napoleon didn't think for one moment we'd be daft enough to put 40,000 men onto Walcheren. But the minute that we did, there were enough French troops ensuring that they weren't going to go anywhere. Antwerp was never under any credible threat. And you can't take Antwerp, you can't really do any serious damage. You could try to hold Walcheren, but Britain didn't really have the logistical capability to hold Walcheren because you put more than a few thousand men on that island, you bust the logistics and basically you bust the latrines. Malaria on its own isn't necessarily lethal, but it's massively debilitating. But you mix it with typhoid, typhus, and dysentery, nearly all of which are feces-related diseases, and you're doomed. Stagnant water kills when men poo in it. And interestingly, that was obvious, and inevitably it came out in the inquiry in 1810 that a British Army medical doctor had wrote about that during the War of the Austrian Succession when the British Army was deployed. And they were using Walcheren as a jumping off and staging post for shuttling men in and out of the Low Countries. They realized that they got sick, and if they didn't look after their hygiene very well, they got really sick. So it was known, but that was buried in the archive. They couldn't very easily search for that. They found out again the hard way. But more to the point, even if they didn't die, that was a sort of tragedy. They wouldn't have gone anywhere. So 40,000 men would have come on, and 40,000 men would have come off instead of a far fewer number. But it would still have had no meaningful strategic results. I mean, there was a marginal benefit in destroying Vlissingen, marginal, but this is a relatively small port that can produce, one or two ships of the line a year, maybe, and it can hold one or two because of sandbanks. It is a useful supply port, and it's a very important port in the region for controlling the region, but it is not in and of itself a port from which you can invade Britain. It's just the port from which you can control Walcheren more easily. So the destruction of Vlissingen was basically how they dressed up an abject failure and tried to look for some nugget of positive. And after that, it's very difficult to know what to do. So you can't directly deploy troops in theatre. So what they did instead, which is actually super bright, they called a conference at Reichenbach, which was when Austria was arguably double dealing. And British policy was to say, look, we all want to defeat Napoleon. What we want is to neutralize Belgium some way or another. We're open to ideas. And the idea that stuck was to say that Belgium was going to become part of the Netherlands, reunited as it hadn't been since the 16th century. But specifically, there will be a clause in the Treaty of Paris that said Antwerp could only be a commercial port. And we know perfectly well that the Dutch won't let it become a big commercial port because they're too jealous of its potential prosperity. So, perfect. So in return for hosing money at the coalition, like hosing money, they got that war aim inserted into what would become the Treaty of Paris. So essentially, Britain ensured that the coalition had the financial wherewithal to be able to invade France, and in return, ensured that that little stretch of coast was dealt with to Britain's satisfaction, while also ensuring that Prussia was kept out of the North Sea, interestingly enough. It's often forgotten that Britain went to war with Prussia in 1806 and didn't trust them an inch. So Prussia's little outposts on the Ems, Emden was removed, Hanover was expanded. And so very briefly, Britain had the perfect security solution, which Napoleon turning up again in 1815 was only a minor headache. But essentially, there was a solution, and the solution was you were going to have to pay Russia and Austria, with Prussia tagging along, to invade France, depose Napoleon, and rewrite the borders of Europe to Britain's satisfaction. And that cost 30-odd million pounds. Of the 50-odd million pounds spent in subsidies by Britain during the entire Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, about 2/3 of them were spent in the final couple of years.
It's amazing what you can do with a lot of money to play with, isn't it?
Well, yes and no, because even with all that money offered, they still try to stab British government in the back and say, well, you know what? We don't want to take British money because we know that makes Britain a global power. We'd rather just have the balance of power. And if France beats Britain, we don't care, so long as we're safe. But as soon as Napoleon said, no, I'm fighting you, they had to have British money, and so they had to go along with the British plan.
Yeah, that's a fair summation, actually, on reflection. It very much feels as though Britain just sort of goes around and waves a checkbook at problems that it doesn't like, and sort of tries to resolve the problem that way during this period. I like the idea of hosing money. I have visions of all of these different memes and GIFs that I'm very fond of, as Liam will attest to.
Yes, quite.
People just kind of hurling money guns, the baby just taking handfuls of money and throwing it out the window. Some of our listeners will be very perplexed if they've never used those GIFs before. I want to talk about 1814, though, because 1814 is what I'm going to describe in technical terminology as a cock-up.
Total.
So why is it a cock-up?
So this is, if it's possible to go back to late 1805, early 1806. So the plan was, before it went horribly wrong, that Napoleon was going to overextend himself probably, but the Russians and the Austrians were going to give him a sound thrashing. But then that would pose a problem for Britain, because then how would Britain dictate what happened in Northwest Europe? What happened on the North Sea coast? So Britain assembled an army of roughly 35,000 men. So it was another really biggie. It was 20-odd thousand Brits, and the King's German Legion came out of this as well, and they were going to land in Hanover. And so Britain would have some skin in the game in freeing the Low Countries. And obviously this force landed, got back on boats and went away because the geopolitical situation was somewhat changed from the expected result. So this reveals that the British government does understand that it's all very well having an agreement and some money, but unless you have boots on the ground, it's really dangerous to assume that your allies are going to do what you ask them to. And in the event, the coalition partners kind of bundled the agreement with the Netherlands and made the Netherlands a really sort of fragile, quasi-autocratic, heavily Protestant monarchy, which the Belgians hated, which is why it all fell apart. And so actually Britain having ground when France inevitably fell would make an awful lot of sense. Again, a little bit like Market Garden. But again, a little bit like Market Garden, you're dealing with forces that are just far too small and frankly far too disorganized to actually make a real difference on the ground. So I think there was a very clear aim, and I think the British government was very good at generating aims. There was a plausible strategy, and that is we need to have an ability to influence what's going on directly, so that, you know, it feels like an age before, but it's worth remembering in the Dutch revolt of so the patriotic war almost of 1787, when the Dutch state was crumbling. There was a potential for a French army to march in, but France realized it couldn't afford an army and triggered the revolution effectively. And it was a Prussian army that marched in and reimposed order on the Dutch. So the British knew very, very well that if they did not have boots on the ground, there could be trouble. So getting some sort of boots on the ground was a really good idea. But because of the level of commitment in the peninsula, because of the level of commitment in the USA, in North America, there just wasn't the ability to generate enough force. And in any event, it had been shown that, you know, enough force is a lot of troops in the context of a European war. So they scrabbled together this sort of hodgepodge and sort of drafted in some Russian help and generally sort of turned an aim into a really terrible operational plan and then made it worse by executing it badly.
I mean, that's one way to look at things like Bergen op Zoom, right?
Yeah.
I want to just fast forward slightly and look at, so, you know, clearly, you know, you could probably, the title of this podcast could probably just be Antwerp is important in block capitals. Do the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars have a lasting legacy for Antwerp? And when does Britain stop looking over its shoulder and, you know, really worrying about the strategic implications of Antwerp?
For sure. So it has a really tragic legacy for Antwerp, which we'll come on to. I'll answer the second part of the question first. So essentially, the Liverpool plan is set out in 1814 and then carried out after the 100 Days. And it's worth remembering that the 100 Days is kind of misnamed because Napoleon only really did any fighting in 3 of them. So there's a very, very big prelude and a very short, sharp shock. But anyhow, the key to the 1814 plan, which was enacted after Napoleon had his go, is to build a series of fortresses around the Belgian-Luxembourg border. There were 21, 22 of them. They were known as the Wellington Barrier. They were co-funded by Britain and the United Netherlands, and they were state-of-the-art. They were designed to not only be a tripwire, but also they were concentric. So there was a major fortress at Ghent as well, which is up the Scheldt on the way to Antwerp if you're coming from France. And there were the plan was that the fortresses would be able to hold out for a month or two in usual siege warfare that Belgium was really famous for, which would be enough time for a British expeditionary force to deploy into Belgium. We'll come on to why it's tragic 100 years later in a minute. So this was a really, really sound plan because the fortresses curled up into Luxembourg, It didn't really matter who was going to invade Belgium. There was a series of defenses which the Dutch and the British could handle on their own. But obviously, France was the main threat. What then happened was the Belgian Revolution, which separated Belgium from the Dutch. And this coincided with the Whig government coming into power against Wellington. And I'm not convinced Wellington fully understood the geopolitics of this. Liverpool did, but Liverpool was dead by this point because Wellington didn't do enough to influence the Whig government, and he should have done as an obviously key security advisor and great man of British military history and statecraft. So Earl Grey was prime minister. This was the guy who stood up in the Lords during the Walcheren inquiry and said, why did we send 40,000 men to support Austria when Austria is fighting in Austria? And that's a waste of time. And Lord Liverpool was then the recently appointed Minister of War, had to explain that actually there were some maritime considerations as well. And clearly he wasn't listening, because he didn't listen in the 1830s. He sent an excitable young chap called Lord Palmerston off to go and negotiate with Talleyrand, who had him for breakfast. But even before Talleyrand was busy having Palmerston for breakfast, the foreign ministers of Russia, Nesselrode, and Austria, Metternich, decided that they didn't really want this united Netherlands where Britain had a whip hand, because it made Britain, it locked in British control of the continent, because Britain could basically pay any one of the great powers to fight the other great powers. So they wanted to undermine this entire thing. So it was principally a Russian idea to say, I know what we'll do. We'll make Belgium neutral. And we'll all guarantee it, because what could possibly go wrong? And the Whigs, being anti-war and wanting to cut down the cost of the British army, which was still over 200,000 men at this point, said, brilliant idea. We love that idea. Let's get rid of all of those fortresses. Let's not worry about being able to deploy an army into Belgium really quickly, because what could possibly go wrong? And remarkably, not a lot did go wrong for a while. There's a very funny incident that shaped global history when Napoleon III desperately wanted to get his hands on Belgium, and the British did everything in their power to prevent him from doing so. But unfortunately, Bismarck spotted an opportunity and said to Napoleon III, maybe we would be mindful of you being allowed to have Belgium if you allowed us to unify Germany under Prussia. And Napoleon said, that's really interesting. And Bismarck said, would you mind writing that down, just to make sure that we have a clear agreement? And he did this a few years before the Franco-Prussian War, but immediately the Franco-Prussian War broke out, he revealed this letter to the British government and said, look, if France wins, they'll take Belgium. So you wouldn't want that. You better let us get on with it. And that was that. And Gladstone basically stood up in Parliament and fully understood Belgium's really important on a lot of different levels. If Belgium's threatened, notwithstanding that Gladstone was an absolute man of peace on principle because he didn't like spending money, we will do something about this. But as it turned out, that didn't have to happen. Sedan is very close to Belgium, but it's not in Belgium. So then the real tragedy is that the Belgians always know they can't trust either the French or the Germans. Sooner or later, some of them are going to get invaded by one of them. So they build their entire fortress system around Antwerp. The Redoute Nationale is Belgium's strongest fortress at the opening of the First World War, because they hoped and prayed that the British army would ignore Dutch neutrality and deploy into it, because it was the right thing to do. And it's what Field Marshal French wanted to do. But three problems. Problem number one is that Churchill couldn't guarantee the sea lanes because of the size of Tirpitz's navy, and that came as a bit of a blow to the government. Problem number two, the Dutch basically said, if you do that, that is war, so forget it. And we wanted to fight a commercial war against Germany, so we couldn't afford to upset the neutrals. And third, the British army already had a plan to go into France and march alongside the French army, because that was going to be a swift victory, wasn't it? So actually, Antwerp being defended principally by a British army in an offensive defensive manner, because it was utterly critical to British geopolitics in order to do it, was essentially what the Belgian plan was to defend itself. And Britain didn't do it.
Blimey, that's a sobering point on which to end. Paul, wow, thank you. I think we've covered about 300 years of history, give or take, which is unusual on this show. Normally we
At
are
speed, sorry.
no, not at all. Normally we keep ourselves confined. If we do 30 years in one podcast, then we feel out of breath. So this has been absolutely fantastic, folks. You've been listening to Paul Leyland, a strategy advisor and the author of Britain's Achilles Heel, which is a chapter in Hellion's Sailors, Ships, and Sea Fights edited collection, which was edited by Nick Kaiser and is available at hellion.co.uk. Paul, huge thanks once again for joining us. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We will be back very soon. Hello again, folks. Please remember to whack that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on the huge amount of content we're producing as we push out episodes 3 times a week. And if you're loving the show, why not leave a 5-star review? It helps bump us back up the algorithm and reconnect with our lost audience following the Spotify meltdown. Did you know that you can now join a mailing list to get regular updates on all the news about newly released episodes, meetups for patrons, new lines of merch that have dropped, and much more besides? To sign up, contact us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get your regular Napoleonic bulletin direct to your inbox. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you could spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in early October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbal, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, John Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and the enigmatically, easy for me to say, named Zed, which isn't just me boosting the numbers before anybody comes at me. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you.